Hi all, let's have a look at another historically important game in the Evolution of Style series. So another game from the Boleslavsky-Bronstein match of 1950. Let's have a look. So Boleslavsky in this game kicked off with e4, and we have Bronstein playing the Royal Paz, and actually the Berlin defense. Yes, this is the Berlin defense, but with castling here, d6 was popular at the time. I believe it was not really explored. The modern treatment is knight takes e4. So you get this variation, d4 for example, here hitting the bishop, takes, and this might have been rejected on the grounds that the king's been displaced, but you know, black's got the bishop pair, and this is very, very popular nowadays, this position. But back in 1950, the evolution of this opening, it seems d6 was considered the main move. There's also, of course, bishop c5. That's also quite popular as well. But d6 was one of the main moves instead of knight takes e4. And this does seem more passive for black, this structure, this way of playing the Berlin defense. We have d4, bishop d7, knight c3. White seems to have a very comfortable position. Bishop e7, and now Boleslavsky actually took on c6, and not with the idea of winning e5 because his own pawn is under attack. He protects this pawn. Okay, so you might think this is slightly controversial, giving up the light square bishop, but there is now a lot of pressure on e5. How does black actually address the pressure on e5? Well, Bronstein accepts a little center. This little center, it's a little bit more passive, that structure now, and white of course has got a good view of the d5 square potentially. Castling now, bishop f4, knight d7. Of course black can try and use the dark squares here. Rook ad1, bishop f6. Now a very interesting idea, b4, immediately threatening to trap the bishop, or so it seems, but this is a clever reply. Rook e8, putting more pressure on e4, and if b5 now, it is actually possible to play knight c5, hitting the queen and hitting e4. So if the queen moved, we can take this pawn on e4. So I guess you can call this a little trap, positional trap, but rook fe1 is played instead. And now again, b5 does seem a cause for concern. We have bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and against b5 the radical move b5 is played by David Bronstein to stop white playing b5. Okay, but you know, he's given up his dark square bishop there for this position, and white still seems to have a more aggressive central position. Black seems to be a bit passive, and in fact here, with white's extra spatial advantage, he creates a rook lift, rook d3. So that's looking at things like potentially rook g3 is going to be dangerous, and bishop g5. We're looking at g7 immediately. Queen f6 is now played, queen takes, knight takes, and white supports his own pawn on e4. So black's pawn here is vulnerable. It can be built on that d5 square, and although there's a pin here, I'm not sure it's in black's favor to do this, trying to exploit the pin, because I think white can just play e5 in this position. So the little center has to be kept intact. a5 instead, we have a3, a takes, knight d7 is played. So black has got that e5 square, but this big d5 square is now used, knight d5, and it hits immediately c7. Bronstein has to defend c7. Rook ed1. It's just a very nice position for white here. Knight e5. White voluntarily gives up the bishop. The knight could have been a nuisance, coming to c4 for example. Rook takes. Now knight e3 is played, and by taking away black's possibility of bishop takes d5, rook c3 now is on the cards. We have bishop d7, rook c3, so bishop d7 in advance, rook c3, tying this rook down on a7, bishop e6, rook d4, as though by protecting the pawn, f4 now is possible, and then maybe f5. g5 stops f4, g3. So renewing the idea that f4 could be played. King f8, but the king just comes to the center for the moment. f6. Rook d3. Okay. So here actually there's a possibility of rook a3 with rook d3. It supports rook a3, and if white gets down the a file, well, there's targets here, a5 and a7, to hit b5 and c7 respectively. An energetic reply here from David Bronstein, trying to undermine white's center, g4, trying to undermine this pawn chain. But rook a3 is played anyway. White is accepting the risk of slight fragmentation, but he's got an aggressive rook now on the a file, and this rook seems stranded on e5 at the moment in an embarrassing way. But it can go to h5. That's another point. h5 was vacated for the rook by playing g4. F takes g4, rook takes h2, king f3. But it still seems as though with this rook on the a file, this is a more dangerous rook at the moment than black's rook. The knight comfortably defends c2 for the moment. We have king e7, rook a8, bishop c4. And this, of course, means knight f5 check. It looks scary to allow knight f5 check. But this is a tricky position. Knight f5 could be played anyway, perhaps. And then there's going to be trouble with things like rook c7, etc., or rook b8. So bishop c4 here was played. Knight f5 check. And now rook h8, tying down the black rook here. Unless it wants to give up h7, unless David Bronstein does. He does, in fact, take on c2, allowing this check. But again, it looks as though white's pieces are slightly better, and there's an immediate target now, the f6 pawn. The counter target b4, and they swap. Prisoners there, g5, but this is a more advanced, well, quicker pass pawn than black's b pawn. Bishop d3. Rook e6, protecting that pawn. d5. If e takes, then there's bishop takes f5. But there is knight e7 check here. King d7. And now e takes, protects the rook, which is protecting the knight. So yeah, black is a pawn down. King f4, and still this pawn looks dangerous. It's supported already by the knight for g6. Check. Now king g4. Check. Rook e4. Now here a very clever reply so that black doesn't gobble this d5 pawn. Can you see what white plays in this position? It's a very strong move to hold things together. If I give you 5 seconds, what would you play in this position? So 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, knight g6. It means that on rook takes we can play knight f8 check. But b4 was played, but knight f8 check played anyway. And now g6, it's holding that pawn, and the king's holding that pawn. Rook takes. Now, what do we play here? In this position, what would you play? You've got to be careful. Okay, g7 was played. Not taking back the rook, in fact, because there's a possibility of bishop takes and then b3, or if the knight takes, that improves the black's black's king for king e7. So we're playing g7. It's immediately threatening to queen. Can black do anything here about this pawn? Because actually the h7 square is covered by the knight. We have bishop e2 check, king g5, rook e4. That looks resourceful for rook g4 check. If the pawn queens, king f6. This does mean now after rook g4, there's knight g6 blocking that rook. And this is the end for black, isn't it? Surely rook takes g6 is played. King takes. Check. King h6. And now how does Bronstein stop this pawn queening? He can't. 1-0. Bronstein resigns. So this is one of the decisive games of the match in kind of the old way of playing the Berlin defense, kind of passive. It seems as though white, by giving up the light square bishop, did have a dominating position in the center. Black's center was quite passive, and it was expertly exploited, in fact, by Boleslavsky. But so yeah, there's an evolution of an opening here as well, which we see a lot today, of course, the Berlin defense. But this is an old way of playing it. So I hope you got something out of that. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.